Cool. All right. Well, thank you all so much for being here. This is the session on authority, abuse, and abolition, reimagining church and community. Just some background about why did I want to do this session. I've been coming to QCF for a while now. I think maybe around 8 years, 7 or 8. This might be my 7th time coming. And, we talk a lot about theology, and we talk a lot about the Bible. And that's important because those are parts of the way that we experience harm. But fixing our theology and fixing the way that we interpret the Bible is actually not enough for us to heal and to have communities of flourishing. We have to think about how we organize ourselves and community. And I'm going to be talking a lot about this word called polity, which, who here has heard the word polity before? Oh, we got some nerds in the audience. I love y'all. All right, you're here because you love polity. I got it. So, so the question is not just what do we believe, but how do we create our communities? How do we navigate difference? How do we self-govern? And so I'm going to talk about, some basics of polity for those who, it seems like lots of you already know. We're going to cover some of the most popular types of church governance structures, and then talk about the strengths and weaknesses of different ones. And hopefully this will help us to build resilience in our communities so that we can organize and advocate more effectively. Good intentions are great, and even having the truth on our side is important. But the how we go about it is also very important. And I think I've just seen a lot of burnout. I've seen a lot of people, maybe pushing a door that's a pull, and I want to make sure that we, use our hearts, our spirits, and our minds in this really important work. So I care about this because I think it's something that touches our lives. All right. So who am I? My name is Sue Ann Shaw, and as I mentioned, I come here a lot, but I'm Taiwanese American. I do music, I've made a film, I do organizing, ethnomusicology, and I'm in seminary right now, and I'm in the ordination process in the Presbyterian Church, which I'll talk a little bit more about later. So I care a lot about these questions of political organizing and also church and justice issues. And if you're interested in, some of my creative works, the names of those are up there on my bio or on my website. But today I'm actually going to talk a little bit more about the organizing stuff that has helped me as I've been trying to do activism in a lot of different spaces, both in the church and outside of it. So I think if you're here, it's maybe because you have questions about how do we organize, but also maybe abuse happened to you too, like it happened to me. And maybe that's why you're here too, to ask those questions, not only what happened to me, but how do we keep it from happening to other people? And how do I keep this from replicating? How do I keep myself from doing the same harm to other people that was done to me? So, what is authority, right? Authority is power. Hierarchy, maybe those are some of the words that we imagine when we talk about it. What other words come to mind for some of you when you hear the word authority? Feel free to shout it out. Power. Yeah. Control. That's a good one. The threat of violence. Okay. All right. And what is abuse? What is abuse's relationship to authority? So, and I'll get more into this in the next slide. And then, of course, I had to have a 3-word alliteration. So, abolition. Why is abolition in this? So, abolition, if you might have heard about the abolition of slavery or modern abolitionist movements, they think about how harm happens to the world and ask for a path forward where no one is expendable, incarcerated, or canceled, right? A community for you to belong to and for justice to be served. My old pastor, he used to say something to me that has stuck with me over the years, which is there is no such thing as free from, only free to. And I want us to frame that conversation here because so much of our life is about what we're trying to get away from. The freedom from oppression, from hatred, from shame, from toxic church community. But what comes after that? What are we being free to? To be in a beloved community with one another, to have fun, to see beauty, to experience joy and love and justice. So there's a book that is kind of famous in the queer community. Some of you might have heard of it. It's called Conflict is Not Abuse. It's a little bit of a mess, but I do think that the author was trying to get at something that is really common in our spaces. So Schulman uses this definition of abuse, which is one person maintaining a system of pervasive and unethical dominance and control over another person. So what's the difference between conflict and abuse? I would say that the difference is power, right? Like, we have disagreements with each other as humans all the time, right? But just because like you want pineapple on your pizza and I don't, doesn't mean that you're abusing me. Unless I'm just being hyperbolic for the sake of comedy. And and so I think that, abuse, sometimes it's like, oh, I just know what it is when it is. But oftentimes there's that sense that there isn't a choice, right? That someone is making choices for you, or that there's a threat. Someone said earlier, threat of violence. And there's lots of different kinds of violence. The one that you probably know the most about is physical violence, right? And yeah, LGBT people experience hate crimes and physical violence, but our pain is more than just those explicit expressions of physical violence. We experience violence in all sorts of ways. Foucault, a lot of his work is around this and the kind of invisible things that govern our society that push us to conform. But again, we use our analysis and we think a little bit about how does abuse happen? What are the systems? Where do they come from? So, sometimes when a person is cruel, this is a very interesting review of Conflict is Not Abuse that I found on Substack. Sometimes when a person is cruel, they're cruel because they have learned that it's all right to hurt some kinds of people, or that only their feelings matter, or that you don't have to take certain people's needs into account. But sometimes when a person is cruel, it's because they're hurt or scared. I think I've seen that a lot in this community. They fly into a rage over minor things because they're afraid that if they don't, the person will walk all over them. Sometimes, people emotionally manipulate their romantic partners because they don't know how they pay the rent. Or they lash out about, something that's a small but harmless joke, but it's not just that joke. It's because it's brought up every single other bad joke, pain, and even sometimes the violence that they experienced previously. And so then the weight is not just what happened in the moment, it's the weight of what's happened in history. And that's what we're always navigating in this space, right? Now, I think we've talked a little bit about this with the community ethos, but it is important for people to be safe. But being safe isn't the same thing as just feeling comfortable or feeling safe, right? Now, it's really hard, I know, for me when I'm triggered, because I have, religious trauma and PTSD, to distinguish what level of threat things are. And being able to go to trauma therapy and work through some of those has given me tools to recognize when I'm triggered so that I don't blow up over something small because I think it's the end of my life. My triggers are often if someone disagrees with me, I'm afraid I'm going to get canceled because that's what happened in my church, right? But just because someone disagreed with me about a small political thing, it doesn't mean that I'm now going to lose my entire community and friends, even though in the moment it feels like it. Once I can come down a little bit from it, I'm like, oh, okay, that's actually not what's happening. Okay. But this is what's hard about living in community, right? And that's what's hard about living in this particular community, is that there's so much trauma and so much pain. And so how we go about organizing ourselves and dealing with that is really important. So here are some questions that I want to leave all of you with. not just for today, but also things that you can apply to the context in your life, wherever you are, wherever you're coming from, or wherever you might go. Where do these systems come from? And where does power or authority come from? And then, of course, how does abuse happen? So we're going to look at, the next slide is going to maybe have, is anyone familiar with this umbrella thing? Yeah, the Gothard. Yeah, sorry. Trigger warning on that one. So this is a diagram that was used a lot, I believe, in like a conservative evangelical homeschool movement. And this is one model of authority, right? That some of you might have implicitly grown up with or explicitly grown up with, which is the idea that Christ gives authority to pastors who, protect the church, and then the pastors have oversight over husbands who then protect the families and have authority over like the wife and then the children. So this is a hierarchy, right? And this is often how authority and power is understood. Now, when I was Googling to find this very old and iconic abuse of authority in diagram, this one on the right actually came up too, which I was like, that's great. Yeah. I would say that my belief is like the one on the right, which is like everyone is equal at the foot of the cross, right? And that Christ in God is the ultimate authority, and that like the rest of us, we're just people, and we don't have special authority. Now, that's my personal belief, and it reflects my theology and my political kind of orientation, and also like my commitments to different denominations. I will now talk about denominations who don't do that. And I just want to make it very clear that I have no hatred for them. I have a disagreement, and I respect people's right to kind of organize for themselves, but it's important for people to understand, sometimes you go to a church and you're just like, wow, those people are really nice. And I like the kind of music that they do. And so you're like, I'm in. But then you start to realize the bigger structure that church is under and how that affects just you on a individual and congregational level. And some of this can help. So one of the biggest, most prevalent models is known as the Episcopal or the hierarchical model. And, you find it in Catholic churches, Orthodox, Episcopal, Anglican. So it basically, for anyone who has a bishop, right? So the word comes from episkos in Greek, which is overseer, right? And so, the strength of this is control, right? It's like one person makes a decision and then it just like goes down the line, right? So, maybe you're in a Methodist church and you're like, I don't get to choose what church the church doesn't really get to choose the pastor. The pastor doesn't get to choose what church, like they just have to go where the commission tells them to go. And the similar is very true with like Anglican churches or even in Catholic churches, or like the priest goes where the bishop tells them to go. Now, so one thing about this is kind of fascinating is that unity is established through the head, the leadership. And then like it doesn't actually matter sometimes if everyone else believes something different, as long as they all just agree to do what the bishop tells them to do, or whoever is higher on the hierarchy than them. So in the Catholic Church, for instance, like, if you meet a Catholic, you like, there's so many different types of beliefs, and they'll be like, yeah, but the Pope is the highest authority. I was like, yeah, like the Pope kind of tells us what to do, but like there's so many different ways to be Catholic. And so that's one thing that's kind of interesting, is that there's room for differences, because like as long as like the function of the hierarchy remains the same, then this kind of polity can continue. So weaknesses of this is like a lack of accountability, which, if you follow the issue of like the Boston Globe when they broke the clergy abuse scandal, right? So there's like no way for like regular people to know about the priests who are abusive, who are getting moved around, because these decisions were being made on such a high level, and there's no access to information and no way for people to push back at these appointments, right? Not any structural way to. I'll talk a little bit more about the details of this later on. Okay, so to bring it back to like gay Christians, so an example of how this affects us on a day-to-day level. So I used to live in Nashville, Tennessee, and so that was part of the diocese of Middle Tennessee, I guess. And people are like, oh yeah, the Episcopal Church, they're super gay friendly, whatever. However, in that diocese, they did not perform gay, like same-sex marriages. And it was because the bishop of that specific diocese did not agree with it. So you're like, but what is, like, so how come I can go to an Episcopal church here or one there, but then like, I'm not allowed to do it, but that person's allowed to do it? You're like, okay, it has to do with this structure, right, of how it works. And so that's a struggle. I also had a friend who was going through an Episcopal ordination process who'd come from an evangelical background and thought like he had found the promised land of like liberal Christianity. But then he actually experienced discrimination in his ordination process, and it took him a while to move forward. And it's like, oh, it's like, because actually the way decisions have to do is like that individual bishop didn't like me, right? So that's kind of hard. All right. This might be one that a lot of you are familiar with, because a lot of evangelical churches or Baptist churches or non-denominational tend to use this, which is the Congregationalist model. So this is like, if you are interested in history, some of these movements are called the nonconformists. And also often it's described as pure democracy. So, you know, the churches, like people in the congregation, they make decisions together. You know, I think in Baptist models, they usually like choose elders, right, and deacons, and elect them out of the church, and then those people tend to rule. So, you know, some of the strengths of this is that there's actually a lot of autonomy for individual churches at the local level. You know, there's often hierarchy within the church itself, but those are mostly socialized. They're not always like officially through the structure, which I'll talk about later. But, you know, this model believes that in the priesthood of all believers, right? And so, you know, in the Episcopal model, you have a really big distinction between clergy, like, oh, those are the special people, and then those are the lay people, those are the regular ones. But in the Congregationalist model, it's like the priesthood of all believers, and really emphasizing like equality in a lot of ways. And so I think some of the weaknesses of this is that sometimes on that small scale, the cult of personality, like if the pastor or a specific elder or deacon is like has a lot of social capital, then they can kind of dominate the space and almost become like a mini pope in their church. But you know, sometimes there's a lack of cooperation with other churches, right? You might have a network, you might have a convention, right? These are kind of terms, but every church remains very autonomous from other churches. So, and also the accountability is limited within oftentimes the structure of the church itself, which is hard when someone who's maybe really popular or powerful does something bad. So I'm going to talk about a feminist anarchist text called The Tyranny of Structuralists later, which will address kind of like the issues with the Congregationalist model. But some of you, this might be familiar. So an example of like an LGBT person's story is that like people are like, oh, the UCC, that's like a super pro-gay liberal denomination. Truthfully, like in the UCC model, which is Congregationalist, like basically there's autonomy for all these different churches. So you could go to one UCC church and they're like pride flags, lesbian pastor, whatever, pro-gay. You go to another UCC church and they're very conservative and very homophobic. And that's what's, again, there isn't like this tie of similarity between them, but it's because it depends on the individual church, right? So who has the power to make decisions and how do these things happen? So that is an example, right? So, okay. The next one is the Presbyterian model, which is kind of like in between these two ones that we've talked, which is like super hierarchical, another one that's super flat. So the way these churches work is the presbyter comes from the Greek word that means elder. So, you know, the church elects elders, and then those elders go on a regional level, which is a presbytery, and then they all make decisions about like the region together, kind of like the way a diocese would be, or conference, maybe some of those other words you might heard of. And then General Assembly is what happens on the national level. So then delegates from all of the presbyteries and all the regions go and they make decisions about the national part. So there's some elements of it which are like the national things, and then some of them are a lot about like the local church decision making. And if this sounds familiar to you, it's because that is what the U.S. government's Constitution is vaguely based off of, right? It's like, oh, we have districts, and then we elect representatives, and then we send them to Congress, and then they make decisions on the big level. But there's also deferred powers. So the things that General Assembly on a national level doesn't make decisions about, those are left to like the presbyteries or the local churches to decide. So all of that power, it's left to the local people. So, obviously, like, there's some of the strengths is that there's accountability at every level. So, like, the presbyteries hold the General Assembly accountable, and like the elders from local churches are participating in the presbyteries, and then the congregation also has like a route. So, if a pastor is being abusive in their congregation, they can go to the presbytery to have an investigation done on them, and like that information has to be transparent for the regular people. Now, some of the weaknesses of this model is it's very slow. Yeah, anyone who's ever hung out with Presbyterians knows it kind of takes forever for things to get done, but that's because there's a lot of people involved. There's so many committees. I'm on so many committees. Anyway, and like sometimes I'm actually like, I was at General Assembly last summer, and I was like suffering through this process, and we're like deliberating, and we're just, we're amending these things. And I thought, wow, this kind of sucks, but I actually don't know of a better way to do this that would preserve all the things that I care about. So I was like, the only thing worse than this is not this. But I think the people who laughed are probably Presbyterians. Okay, so anyway, next, like a good Presbyterian, I'm going to go turn to some scripture for us. So Mark 9:35. And he sat down, called the 12, and said to them, if anyone desires to be first, he shall be last of all and servant of all. Well, that's great, Jesus, but how are we supposed to govern ourselves? I was like, this is a great spirit, great idea. But at the end of the day, like, how do we run a meeting? How do we make decisions? Now, I love this because I think that, we should really question why we have hierarchies and why authority exists the way we do. Personally, like, I don't think that God has inherent hierarchy, like, oh, I chose this pastor to be over this husband, to be over this wife. That does not jive with my politics or my theology. But I do think that, we're allowed to self-govern. We're allowed to organize. We're allowed to pick representatives and delegate tasks to people. And I just want to give some opportunity at this moment for people to share a little bit about what their experiences have been around authority leaders in churches. So like, if you've been a part of a church that was more like Congregationalist, like Baptist, that was like, oh, like we make decisions at the church level, maybe raise your hand. I went to a Baptist church for a while. Okay. Who here has been a part of like an Episcopal church or like something with bishops or, okay, yes, okay, we got some, all right. And then who here has been kind of like in the Presbyterian model? Okay, cool, awesome. All right, so thank you for humoring me in that like very dry rendition of some ways that we organize ourselves. So to get to the fun part, so this is a feminist anarchist text called The Tyranny of Structurelessness, which was written in 1971. And the context of it was in the women's liberation movement, written by Joe Freeman. A great emphasis has been placed on what are called leaderless, structureless groups as the main, if not sole, organizational form of the movement. The source of this idea was a natural reaction against the overstructured society in which most of us found ourselves and the inevitable control this gave others over our lives, and the continual elitism of the left and similar groups among those who were supposedly fighting this overstructuredness. Now, it's not 1971, and this isn't the women's liberation movement, but does that feel familiar to anyone in this room? Okay. So the idea of structure, so this is, I'm still reading from her thing. The idea of structurelessness, however, has moved from a healthy counter to those tendencies to becoming a goddess in its own right. I think she's trying to say like an idol. The idea is as little examined as the term is much used. and it has become an intrinsic and unquestioned part of women's liberation ideology. For the early development of the movement, this did not much matter. So, if you want to read the whole thing, you can, but I'm just going to do a really an outline summary of some of this. So she talks about the formal and the informal structures. This is the part that always really struck with me when I read this essay, is she said, when we don't have a structure, when we're trying to make decisions, we always just end up going with whoever is the most popular or whoever has the most social capital. So sometimes social capital is that person has money. And they can make us do stuff because they're well, I'll pay for that. Or, in queer communities, sometimes it's wow, everyone has a crush on that person. So so then when they're what if this was our plan? We're yeah, let's all do that. Or let's go there for dinner. Yeah. Or, sometimes it's that person is just friends with a lot of people. And so then people agree with them. And so this kind of leads to the issue, which Freeman talks about as the star system, which is that in the absence of some of these structures, then someone becomes a star. And I feel this is what I see happen a lot in Congregationalist churches, is usually the star is the pastor, right? It's the reason why the pastor has the job is because the pastor is liked and popular, but then and respected. And what happens though if the pastor is wrong or bad or makes a bad decision? When you try to talk about it, everyone's just oh, why are you why you're making trouble, or just trust him. But and it's sometimes people who are good and that we love and trust also make mistakes and make bad decisions, and we need to figure out a way to hold each other accountable. So the next thing she gets to is not only does this lead to an imbalance within the way decisions are made in a group, but that there's political impotence. So they're not really good at getting stuff done, actually. So she put, unstructured groups may be effective in getting women to talk about their lives. They aren't very good for getting things done. Wow, that feels familiar to me too. So patterns that these groups have, they're, maybe if there's a specific task, oh, we're just gonna put together a newsletter and then we're gonna put that out. They can get that done. But bigger, more complicated decisions, work, really falls apart with this kind of in no structure group. Also, it tends to be relatively small and homogenous. People who are the same tend to gravitate to this, and it makes it really hard to have true diversity because people kind of have to all agree with each other all the time because it doesn't handle those disagreements well. And if someone keeps trying and has different ideas and they get frustrated, they usually leave, right? We've probably seen that. Or maybe you were that person who left. Has to be very high degrees of communication, but then there's also very low degree of skill specialization because of some of this homogenization. So that is kind of some helpful stuff. The next text I want to talk about, which I think can help us in these questions that we're exploring, is Anarchism, or the Revolutionary Movement of the 21st Century, by Grubekic and David and Graeber. So I found this as a helpful introductory text because I do think we're in this very difficult political moment, right? Where there's so many different kind of authoritarian governments. Some of them self-identify as capitalist, some of them self-identify as communist. And what are we supposed to do, right? So I love this beginning sentence. It is becoming increasingly clear that the age of revolutions is not over. I feel encouraged by that. However, it is becoming equally clear that the global revolutionary movement of the 21st century will be one that traces its origins less to the tradition of Marxism or socialism narrowly defined, but of anarchism. And so they go on here to talk about a bunch of different movements. But, sometimes these movements don't explicitly call themselves anarchist. And so, but what they do have in common is that these are some of their core principles: decentralization, voluntary association, mutual aid, network models, and above all, the rejection of any idea that the end justifies the means. Now, you can see that I both bolded and underlined that one because as I've been doing about this work for a really long time, I've seen lots of people do lots of really great harm because they believe that the end justified the means. And I think even the churches and the pastors that I was a part of, they always somehow believed that the kingdom of God and that the gospel, that what they were doing justified whatever means that they were taking. right? And in the end, I think that it undid the end, that what they were hoping to accomplish, and they got lost, right? So that's, I think, seeing the way that those justifications have fallen apart has led me to really think deeply about how do the means and how are the means the ends and the ends the means, right? So above all, anarchism as ethics of practice, this is this idea of building a new society within the shell of the old, or, movement of movements. It's not so much that anarchism is a movement in and of itself, but that you can find them in all the movements, trying to hold their communities accountable and to ask those hard questions. And, it's not so much about like, we're going to seize power and then we're going to be the ones who basically do the bad things now. Like, sometimes I get very discouraged because I listen to people, self-identified liberationist revolutionaries, and then I realize that their vision of liberation is actually they just want to do to other people what used to be done to them. And that is not actually liberation to me. That is just I want to be at the top of the hierarchy now. Deep in my soul, I'm going to say this is my like theological, spiritual, gut, political thing is I never want to happen to other people the abuse that happened to me, right? And that's why I'm doing this, and this is why I'm here, and I think that's the questions that we all have to wrestle with within ourselves. So the failures and the catastrophes resulting from so many efforts to overcome capitalism by seizing control of the apparatus of government in the 20th century, it didn't work the way that, a lot of these revolutionary movements thought they would. And what happened is they ended up recreating a lot of the same elitism, a lot of the same hoarding, a lot of the same problems of greed that happened before. And I think for me, that's where the spiritual part really comes in because, so far we've been reading, these are like non-spiritual, non-theological, non-Christian texts. But I think that we all understand that we are all in a great battle in our own souls. That, temptation comes to us in many forms, in different stages of our lives when we have sometimes it comes when we don't have power, and sometimes it comes to us when we do have power. And that the promise of the gospel is that we would be free from the shackles and the temptations of sin and liberated to righteousness, right? To do the good and to not again repeat these things over and over and over again. I appreciated this, on one level, it is a kind of faith. We're back to the non-Christians. A belief that most forms of irresponsibility that seem to make power necessary are, in fact, the effects of power itself. In practice, though, it is a constant questioning, an effort to identify every compulsory or hierarchical relation in human life and challenge them to justify themselves. For me, coming from the Reformed tradition, the Reformation was, in a sense, a religious revolution against hierarchy. And it was questioning these issues. It was saying, why? Why do we have these power structures? Where does authority come from? And can we say that authority from God is also the authority that governs us in our civil society, right? And so my pastor used to always say, reformed means reforming. That we are always asking, we're always questioning, and we're always wondering because we never stop needing the gospel, right? Because we never stop needing this renewal and resurrection because sin continues to persist, right? Even in our best efforts. So one thing that I appreciated here, he said, anarchists are distinguished by what they do and how they organize themselves to go about doing it. Like, some movements are like, well, we believe this, right? And that's who we are. And I'm like, okay, but what do you do? How do you actually live out this idea or this thing? So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to go back to scripture for 1 Samuel 8. Anyone familiar with this story? Israel demands a king. Now it came to pass when Samuel was old that he made his sons judges over Israel. The name of the firstborn was Joel, etc., etc. I'm going to fast forward a little bit, but you got the idea. Then all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel and said, look, you're old, and we don't like your sons. So just give us a king like everybody else, because, this whole prophet thing's not working for us. And Samuel was not happy. He said, and they said, give us a king to judge us. And Samuel prayed to the Lord. And the Lord said to Samuel, heed the voice of the people in all that they say to you, for they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me, that I, the Lord, should not reign over them. According to all the works that they have done since the day that I brought them out of Egypt, even to this day, with which they have forsaken me and served other gods. Now therefore heed their voice. However, you shall solemnly forewarn them and show them the behavior of the king that will reign over them. So Samuel told all the words of the Lord to the people who asked for a king. He said, this is the behavior of the king who will reign over you. He will take your sons and appoint them for his own chariots and to be his horsemen, and some will run before his chariots. He will appoint captains over his thousands and captains over his 50s, and will set some to plow his ground and reap his harvest, and make his weapons of war and equipment for his chariots. So he's going to make your kids go to the military. He's going to tax you and take the things that you have. He's going to take your daughters. He's going to be perfumers, cooks, and bakers. He will take the best of your fields, your vineyards, your olive groves, and give them to his servants. He's going to take 1/10 of your grain and your vintage and give it to his officers. He's going to take your servants, your donkeys. He's going to put them to work. He's going to take all these things from you. And you will cry out in that day because of your king, whom you have chosen for yourselves, and the Lord will not hear you in that day. Nevertheless, the people refused to obey the voice of Samuel. They say, no, we will have a king over us, that we may be like all the nations, and that our king may judge us and go out and fight our battles before us. I think that this scripture passage is very interesting because for all of the people talking about, biblical authority, kings, blah, 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 etc., justifying, hierarchy and authority, people don't talk about this passage a lot, right? In this passage, the prophet Samuel is saying, but God says you shouldn't have a king. In fact, your life will be worse if you have a king. And also, God is saying by choosing a king, you're rejecting me. Why not have me, the Lord, be your only true authority? Why make human authority in the likeness of God? Why not just have God? And then at the heart of this is a question of idolatry. It's saying, but we just want to be like everybody else. We don't want to be set apart. And I think that part of the problem of Christian nationalism today is that it said, we just want to be like everyone else. We want to have our movements. We want to be imperialists. We want to have power. But when we really look at the life and the preaching and the message of Jesus Christ, the first shall be last and the last shall be first. We are called actually to give up power, right? And so I think that, wrestle with this, meditate on it, think about your life, think about your churches, think about your families, think about our government and what it means today that people say, well, God has chosen this government, right? And that these people are good and just and we should obey them. Sometimes I think it's right to obey the government, and sometimes, in fact, a lot of times, I think it's not. And there's lots of examples throughout the scripture that discuss this, but it might not have been what you heard about in church or from your parents because they wanted you to do what they told you to do. They're like, because you have to obey me because God says you have to obey me. But at the end of this, I just want to say, I think that our transformation comes through an invitation, not coercion. Right? I think that when I look at the ministry of Jesus and the things that he said and he did, he said, come with me and everything will change. And what's hard is like that people can say no. And someone's like, well, how are we all going to get on the same page? How are we all going to do the same thing? It's like, sometimes we won't. Sometimes you're going to invite people and they are not going to want to come. And sometimes if you made them come, it would no longer be fun or good. And we have to let people do that, right? And so even though I think that Presbyterian polity is the best way to self-organize between autonomy and, self-determination, I kind of believe that, if you want to be a part of a more hierarchical church, you probably have your reasons. I just want to make sure you understand and you know what you're getting into. And to not be like, well, okay, if I can just make this argument that, it's okay, gay marriage is okay, or this for the Bible, that everything will be fine. It's like, we have to navigate these structures. So for instance, in the Presbyterian church, what had to happen, so we have individual pastors and they can decide for themselves if they want to marry people. But what we did in order to make change on the national level is we had to go to General Assembly, and then we proposed an amendment to the Book of Order, which said marriage, is defined as two people, not just a man and a woman. And then representatives from every single presbytery had to vote on that to approve it. Then it had to get ratified by like a certain percentage of presbyteries. But now that choice is in the Book of Order on a national level. What happens to make change at your Methodist church, your Lutheran church, your Episcopal church, your Baptist church, it's going to look different depending on the structure of it. And sometimes it's not just about convincing people with your arguments or with the Bible or with theology. Sometimes it's about getting the votes. Sometimes it's not about the vote. Sometimes it's convincing one person who's in charge of making a decision, usually a bishop. And that is just your work is gonna look different depending on where you are, who you're working with, and what you're trying to do. So one thing, I wanna leave us with a few general principles from the Presbyterian Book of Order that I find very moving in this time of a great uncertainty for us politically and also for our communities. So these are some things that were written in 1788 and the beginning of the Presbyterian Church in the United States, principles that I really, really feel on a deep level that help me to navigate a diverse space like QCF, right? So the first principle is that God is the Lord of the conscience, right? That every person has their own conscience and you can't make them think or feel something. That is their conscience and they have the right to that judgment. And also, I do believe that I don't want my religion to be determined by the government, and I also don't want my religion to determine what the government is for everybody, right? So this is our classic idea of the separation of church and state, right? Presbyterians are like, well, the church will be the church and the state will be the state, not trying to do a Presbyterian takeover of America. The next thing is we all individually feel and decide things, but we have to make decisions together. So the next principle is corporate judgment, right? So we all have a responsibility first to ourselves and to our consciences, but then we also have a responsibility to work together, right? And I think everyone has this right. The next one makes sense, knowing two things I just said. It's called mutual forbearance, which says that good people submitting to God, scripture, the word, the truth, people of good character and principles, they differ sometimes. They end up at different conclusions. And then this is not a flaw, and this is not something that's broken, but it's actually something about the diversity of our human experiences that proclaims to God. And it's actually our duty for Christians and our societies to exercise mutual forbearance with one another. There's lots of people in this community I disagree about things with, but I am blessed by them, right? And it's my place. Sometimes it's hard, and sometimes those arguments are very fierce, but I think I'm better for it. And I want our communities to be better for these differences and discussions, and that we can exercise mutual forbearance with each other. The next thing is I do think that it's important that our leaders are chosen by the people who are being governed. And so part of this, too, is understanding that the power they have is not special from God. I think that it's a human power. And so in the same way, that can also be taken away when humans decide, wow, this person is really abusing the power that we gave them. Maybe we should not let them keep doing it. So that leads us to the seventh point that I put is that these are human powers delegated, and at least for Presbyterians, we believe that scripture is the ultimate authority, right? We can make decisions as humans, but that is like a lower level of authority than that which really comes ultimately from God. So my last slide here is Joe Freeman's ideas about things that can help us to organize democratic structures that are politically effective. Delegation is really important. So we can decide, okay, that person's going to take care of that task, that person's going to be in charge of this thing, right? And that people who have been given that authority are also responsible for the things that they have been given power over. So we're going to distribute all those things, but we're also going to give it to as many people as possible and rotate so that everyone doesn't get burned out. Right? So it's not just one or two people doing everything, because not only is that a burnout, but it also means that they get a disproportionate amount of power if they're in charge of too many things, right? So these allocations of responsibilities, ability, interest, and responsibility. So, some people are like really good at cooking, and some people are really good at doing technology things. And sometimes it's like, okay, well, they're going to do that one because like I don't really want to eat the dinner that they're going to cook, but I do want to listen to the music that they're going to play. And so it's like, okay, they have the ability, they have the interest, and now they will have the responsibility for that. But she kind of talks about this in contrast to popularity, because sometimes people are like, oh, why should someone do that? Well, everyone just likes them, so we should have them do it. And that's what's so hard, right? Is that those are like the informal structures that are a part of governing our communities. Is oftentimes it's not that someone has inherent authority because of some hierarchical structure, but they have authority because they're well liked, or they're good looking, or everyone wants to sleep with them. People. And also, the other thing that's really important is people should have opportunities to learn different skills, right? So just because you don't have a certain skill doesn't mean that you can't acquire it. And also, if you have a skill, you have a responsibility to share that with other people. There's a phrase that was popular in the African American community: each one, teach one, right? So it goes back to when people were not allowed to learn to read and write. It's like, if you had the privilege of being learned how to have literacy, someone taught you how to read and write, it's your responsibility to teach someone else that, so it doesn't get lost. So you shouldn't do everything yourself, you should delegate, and also we should teach each other how to do things so that burnout doesn't happen. So all of those things have to do with tasks. The next part, information, right? Who gets access to information, and how and when and where? And those need to be equally accessible. So sometimes you might have been a part of a group where it's like there were some secrets, only certain people knew about it, and then that really changed the way the decisions were made. Or, the obvious example that we were talking about earlier is which of these priests is abusing children? And only people on the top of the hierarchy got to know that. And so then the people downstream, like, they couldn't do anything about it. I remember when Church Clarity was founded a few years ago, and that was actually very revolutionary, not because it was like changing church hierarchy in any sort of way, but it was actually trying to provide information, right? So it used to be like, you're like, oh, is this church affirming or not? Does this church ordain women? Does this, like, what is their position on this? And everything was just word of mouth. It's like, maybe someone would tell you, or maybe like you went to the church and you had a good relationship with the pastor, so when you asked that pastor, they would actually give you a straight answer. A straight answer. But oftentimes that wasn't the case. Like, maybe you're a visitor, maybe it's the first time, and then the pastor kind of like dodges it, and they're like, we welcome everybody, and you're like, okay, but what does that mean? You can't even get an answer out of this guy. It's usually a guy. But with Church Clarity, there's just this process of accountability that said, just answer these 5 questions, yes or no, and then we're going to put it on the website. And I know that there were a lot of pastors at that time, straight pastors, who thought of themselves as allies, who are really angry about this because like, but I want to tell them that I want them there. And I'm like, that's actually for the queer person to decide if they want to go to a church that won't marry or ordain them or allow them membership. Like, you could like them a lot and really want them to be a member of their community, but ultimately you want them to remain a 2nd, 3rd, 4th class citizen within your church, and you're withholding information in order to keep them there, right? They're leading you on. And so in that sense, it was very revolutionary to have access to this information and resources available in a transparent way online. So I think that like these are a couple examples of ways that, organizing resources, etc., can help us. I would love for us to kind of like go into a time of discussion and like hear about the different projects that you have been working on or things that you're interested in, like the stuff that's happening both like within the church and outside of it, because obviously these principles, these ideas that we have about how we govern ourselves, how we organize, like they're relevant both in all of those spaces and they affect one another. And I really hope that in the end of the day, like in this dire moment that we are in, that we will identify that, yeah, sometimes the power is in balance. The scales are tipped, but that doesn't mean we're helpless, right? We can do something and we can make a difference in each other's lives, even if it's just like doing mutual aid to making sure people are not hungry. I know that when people aren't hungry, they have better capacity to think about things that are going on in their lives around them. It's hard to pay attention when you're just trying to wonder where your next meal is going to be. And those relationships that we build when we take care of each other, they're also the foundation of trust that allows us to be able to organize and to change things in our society. Whether that might be like making sure that there's a light and a crossing guard at a street where the children are playing to make sure children don't get hit by cars, or there's a bike lane in your community, or it might just be, oh, well, what if we had a gender neutral bathroom in our church? How would we go around actually getting a gender neutral bathroom in our church? Who's in charge of the facilities? Does that decision need to go through like the congregation? Does it go through the session? Does it go through the priest? Those are all things that will make our work hopefully feel a little bit more sustainable. And once we identify these things, we can also pass them on, this knowledge and this information, so that you can take a break, because I want all of you to be able to take a break. All right. Thank you all for this. Yeah. Any questions, responses, ideas? I would love to hear stories too, if anyone has stuff to share. Do we want to hand, or do you want to come? Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing just all these really well-formulated thoughts with us. Thank you. Thank you for sharing all of this. One thing I think about when I go home and I share information, I often think about like the rebuttals my mother will have. And you said something that I really loved about where does power come from, and that power that people have is given to them by us. And yet some people, when they are reading the scripture, they'll really hone on those passages about power comes from God, and therefore feeling much less likely then to try to have any kind of change or try to think on their own or think critically. So how would you, like for Christians who really lean on those verses about power comes from God, like kind of respond to that? Thank you.
Well, I think so. The question is, what do you say to people, and especially Christians, who say that the power comes from God? Now, I think there's lots of different kinds of relationships that we have in our life. I do think that the parental relationship is a special one that is talked about in Scripture, like honor your mother and father. But we have lots of examples throughout Scripture where people pushed back at their elders. So some of it is like, you have all these kings of Israel. Some of them are good, some of them are bad, and they often disagree about things. One passage that I was looking at recently was Josiah the Reformer. So he's like considered one of the good kings of Judah, because most of them were pretty bad. And so he finds the scroll and he finds the Torah, and he's like, oh wow, we're worshiping wrong, right? We have all these idols and we're worshiping false gods, and I need to clean out all this stuff. And it's like, well, maybe your father was the one who put that idol there, right? And so one of the things that I realized, and I wrote a sermon about this, was the god Molech, who is the god of child sacrifice, right? So it's like you offer your children, you kill them in order to satisfy this god. And it's actually written in Leviticus, like, you shall not sacrifice your children to the fires of Molech. And Josiah destroys the shrine, right? That's been there. And so I was doing some investigation, and I was like, but why was there a shrine to this false god Molech? It's like, actually, it was Solomon. Solomon was the person who built the shrine to this false god where they offered child sacrifices, which is expressly against what it says in Leviticus. And I was like, that's hard, because Josiah is also cleaning the temple and which Solomon built, and trying to like honor their ancestors and the things that, this lineage have done. And at the same time, I'm on one place, I'm restoring something that I was handed down to me, and on the other end, I'm also destroying, right? And so you can see in this sense that the highest authority is actually God, not the parents, not the grandparents, not, his ancestors. And I think that what it comes down to in that is that humans are flawed. Humans are sinful, and we make mistakes. You make mistakes, I make mistakes. We're going to be wrong sometimes. And what we need is actually the time your friends and your family need you the most is not when they're right, it's when they're wrong. And if we can go about that in a way that's loving and understanding, say, well, is there ever a time that you might have, like if I was going to talk to my parents, I say, is there ever a time that you realized that you were wrong or that you had made a mistake? Maybe I would share a story about how I changed my mind because I realized I was wrong. So there were things that I used to disagree with my parents about, like going to Chinese school. And as I got older, I was like, wow, I really hated going to Chinese school, but my parents were right to make me go. And I'm really thankful for it now. But then I have all these political disagreements with my parents too about things. So it's like sometimes you change your mind. Sometimes your reason comes differently. But I think that at the end of the day, you say, I love you. God loves you. And you are not defined by maybe a mistake that you made or a judgment that was wrong. And I'm not either, right? And the best way I know how to love you and to obey God, the God that supposedly we both love and cherish, is to disagree with you, right? Now, I think it's easier to do this if you come from a Protestant tradition. I'm going to be honest. I often point to the Reformers and the work of the Reformation to say, if we really value the church, we also need to reform constantly. It's never ending, right? If you're Catholic, it's a lot harder. I'm not Catholic, so I can't really make that argument. Maybe somebody who's Catholic can. But but this streak of reformation is so important to me, and I think it's helpful. Yeah, it's helpful to just like people are fallible and human, and it doesn't mean that you're gonna go to hell or that I never have to listen to anything you ever say again. But rather just say like, okay, well, why do you believe this? Well, maybe they believe it just because they were told I have to believe it from another authority. So you say, okay, but where did that person get authority? Oh, and a lot of times people never even ask the question. They just say, well, it just is this, and it's always been this, and that's what the Bible says. But once you actually sit down to it and you go, it's like, oh, well, Paul says, oh, we should obey our earthly authorities. But then Paul literally disobeys earthly authorities all the time. So there's some contradictions. There's like, well, clearly there's a judgment call here. Everyone's making judgment calls. Sometimes we obey. Sometimes we don't obey. But at the end of the day, we have conscience, right? And I think that's the thing that we all have to live with is like, you have your conscience, I have mine. And what the Bible says is that we shouldn't grieve the Spirit. We should not act against our conscience, right? And sometimes your conscience is different than mine. And maybe sometimes later you're like, I was wrong. Like my conscience or my gut or my intuition was wrong. But it's even more dangerous to live a lie. And I think that's what's just so much harder to say, to pretend that I believe something, to pretend that I think that this is right, when that's actually really not what I believe deep down. That's actually, to me, the most dangerous, because that's when not only we're grieving the Spirit, we're ignoring ourselves and we're ignoring God, and this is the false testimony. So I hope that helps. Does anyone, we probably have time for one or two more. Okay, we got two more over here.
Thanks so much for being here. I want to ask about coercion and specifically like how you would understand and define that. I'll use the example of a boycott. Boycotts are obviously well attested to in like the history of civil rights and protests and things like that. And at the same time, if you refuse to allow someone to participate to such a point where they can't like provide food for their kids or pay for their housing or things like that, then it gets into an area where I do wonder about coercion. So I wondered if you have a definition or just how you think about that.
Yeah, that's okay. Coercion. So there's an article that I really appreciated from America Magazine, and it's called something about the neoliberal sexuality of the left. And so one thing that it talked about there is how power difference happens in between individual people. And how just because we use consent as a model a lot, be like, well, they consent and I consent and that's fine. But sometimes, even though people consent, there is coercion, right? It's like, it's not really a choice. So a principle that I kind of go back to with this is someone can't say yes to you if they can't say no. So the example they use in that article is an Amazon employee that consents to like minimum wage from Amazon really on the same level, right? Because like Amazon can kind of set its wages the way it wants to, but that individual person can't like they can maybe negotiate a little bit, but they don't really have power. And that's where obviously the idea of collective bargaining and unions comes forth, because it's like if you get all the workers to say, no, we all collectively won't take that, then they're like, we will not be coerced. So yeah, I think that like coercion is important with this. Now, to bring it back to your specific example of boycotts, I think that sometimes with boycotts, it's about profitability more than it is about like individual need. I think that BDS, which is the Boycott, Divest, Sanctions movement, has some really interesting stuff if you read into their work. For instance, like they don't believe in boycotting individuals, right? So they're like, oh, like if somebody, so this is the Palestinian national movement. They're like, we don't believe in boycotting individual Israelis. Like, oh no, like you can't work with that person because they're Israeli. Like they're like, no, that's discrimination, actually, right? We do not support that. What that movement is doing is targeting specific companies with specific demands that have to do with international law. And once they comply with international law, then the boycott ends. So I think what's helpful with boycotts to keep something like that from becoming coercive is that actually there's specific goals and metrics. It's like, we will boycott until this thing, and if you change it under this, and we will not do that. Rather than sometimes it's like, these boycotts are kind of ambiguous, where they're just like, well, we just don't like that person anymore, so we're just like not going to buy stuff, right? I think that in order for boycotts to actually be effective as organizing tools, there have to be specific demands and conditions, and those have to be well communicated. Otherwise, it just feels like bullying. Like, well, we're just going to shun you, we're just going to cancel you, we're just not going to engage with you. If it's organizing, there's a means and ends, and there's an end date. It's like this thing can end if this thing happens, right? So I was actually reading a book about the Koinonia Farm, which was an interracial experiment in the 40s, 50s. I mean, it still exists here in Southwest Georgia. And, you know, basically they lived in this rural agricultural community, and during the civil rights movement, all the very racist white people in their community were like, we will not buy your eggs, we will not sell you fertilizer, like we're going to boycott, our whole town's going to boycott you because you are dangerous interracialists. And they wanted segregation. And so I think what's interesting in that example is it's not exactly like the boycott as a strategy that I just talked about. It was literally just like, well, you pay black people a living wage, so we're just not going to buy your eggs anymore. We're not going to sell you fertilizer or seeds because you eat at an interracially mixed table, right? And they were bombed, and you know, they were shot at all, like basically every day for like decades, for maybe a decade during the civil rights movement. But again, I think I would actually differentiate what happened to the Koinonia Farm as bullying and in coercion, a coercion to end their vision of beloved community and Christian interracialism. But what differentiates that from something like the BDS movement is that like the BDS movement has goals, parameters, and boundaries. And it's important if you're going to have a true effective boycott like they did in South Africa, that those exist, right? Once you do this, these things will end. I hope that helps and answer the question. It's also 3:35 now. And so I just want to respect everyone's time. I saw that there was one more raised hand, so I want to give that person a chance. If you need to go, you can go. If you want to hang out and chat, happy to do so. All right.
I'm curious, as someone who doesn't have a church currently, but finds a sort of my vocation within public schools, and there's probably a lot of systems where we dedicate our lives that are outside of church, but also have these hierarchical structures and sort of systems in place that are tricky to navigate in terms of we're dedicated to these places because we believe in something like education or the shared cause, and literally that's the model that we have in society to use. Like if you care about the kids in your neighborhood and their education, it's pretty much public school. But like I'm on the union committee, and there is a very, within my particular system and many, there's a very like high sense of hierarchy and difficulty in navigating, like, how do we have influence as people without power in a system where literally, like, the paths for accountability really do lead to a lot of, how do you say, like a potential for you to be vulnerable or to, like, lose things, etc., and less possibility for, like, change. Because, like, in my situation, I'm trying to, like, get specific here, but, like, there's not really an alternative system in which to follow my vocation, and I could switch to a different system, but it would be the same problems in a lot of ways. And there's not, like, organizing only has so much impact. There are certain just hierarchies that we have to figure out how to navigate. I'm curious if you have any wisdom around that.
Yeah, that's really hard when your union has kind of cemented some of those hierarchies. I guess I've not been a part of a union, so I can't really speak to that specific problem. But, you know, I think that oftentimes in those situations, people say, okay, well, then you basically have to get elected to that high position, and then once you get there, you'll change it. But oftentimes, like, in order to become the person that then gets elected, you, like, have to do things or make deals or compromises that not make you able to actually do that at the highest level. And that's, I think what's hard about that is that we all have to kind of discern and wrestle decisions like that on our own. Like, I actually have a professor, you know, she was like the first Black woman to be tenured in the theology department at my seminary. And, you know, I was taking this beloved community class with her the other week, and she was talking about the reason I decided to teach this class is because, like, I got really burnt out because I was trying to do everything the way the academy is like, this is what success looks like. And so she did that for a while. She got, like, you know, her flowers, she got her tenure and all these things. And then once she did that, she was like, and now I want to change the way that I actually teach and the way that I put my expectations upon my students. And that is one model, right? And I think that what is really hard about that is that there's a lot of gray area. Sometimes it's not successful, but sometimes it is. Like, sometimes you do finally get someone into one of those positions in a very hierarchical, like, that's what it takes in a very hierarchical community, is a person who's willing to kind of wade through the swamp. And then when they finally get there, hold fast to their convictions that, like, once I get there, I'm actually going to change things, and not, like, let that whole process change them to the point that they no longer do it. That's not really my style. But I think that I don't think it's a totally terrible strategy, because I've seen it work sometimes. Other times I'm like, oh, that person just ended up making so many compromises that they lost their backbone. I think that, you know, obviously there's little ways that we can also change things internally. Like, sometimes it's like you have a group within your denomination, or maybe a group within your union that's working to change things within that structure. And so, like, for instance, like, when we have General Assembly, like, we have all these delegates and everyone votes. There's also all these other orgs, like we have the Peace Fellowship, or we have, like, the Environmental Interest Group. We have the Palestine Justice Network. We have, like, the organizations that are trying to end gun violence. And so they actually do, like, lobbying within our, like, church congress to push people and educate them. So I was, like, asking the Palestine Justice Network, like, how come, like, our denomination has been really good about this issue in a way that others haven't? And they said, well, Presbyterians really care about studying things and, like, knowing why things happen. So the first thing we did is that, like, we just did education. We just worked on a grassroots level to educate people about this issue. And then once we did that, we were able to actually change a lot of people's minds, to the point that we were able to get a popular vote to shift over to make some of these decisions. Now, that's really long-term grassroots work of, like, oh wow, like, education can be transformational. You obviously believe that because you're a teacher, but what does it look like for us to also educate, even within educators, or for pastors to be challenged and transformed, or clergy leaders or lay leaders to be challenged on those things too? Like, some of our activists are clergy, some of them are just lay leaders, right? And you all have gifts to bring to whatever you do. And sometimes it's storytelling, sometimes it's teaching, sometimes it's just taking care of people, like, and then they build trust with you, and you say, oh, well, I think maybe we could do things differently. And then if they trust you, or they're like, yeah, sometimes I've wondered, could we do things differently? And that's sometimes just what it takes. But it's much harder to kill a grassroots movement like that because there's so many people who have found their consciences on their own. Whereas if everyone is just agreeing because of some sort of coercive system, once we have a new coercive person on the top, then everyone just goes back to agreeing with whatever they're told. And that's what makes grassroots movements really uncontrollable sometimes, because there isn't a single point. But it also makes it hard for them to be killed in that way too. Because again, if we all of us here in this community feel this really strong conviction, yeah, maybe you could like disagree or convince one of us, but what about the other like 400 people in the room? I remember there was a pastor who hated me, and he told me that I couldn't be a member at his church unless I like publicly renounced being gay, because he saw that I had like a Twitter and I was like on YouTube talking at this conference. And he seemed to think that I had an authoritarian pull over all of my Twitter followers, because he was like, I want you to go online and tell them you don't believe this anymore, because they'll all listen to you. I was like, those people don't follow me on Twitter because they're going to agree with everything that I say. And like the second I'm like, I renounce homosexuality, then all of them will renounce homosexuality too. I'm like, it's not going to work like that, man. Like, just because you are a dictator in your church doesn't mean that my Twitter followers just are going to do whatever I say now. And just because I change my mind and I'm an influencer, whatever that means, doesn't mean I can influence them to renounce homosexuality. But he seemed to think that's the way it worked. So yeah, that just revealed a lot about like himself more than it said anything about me. But yeah, I was like, the people I'm in community with, they have their own opinions. They have, and I want them to think for themselves, and we think together. We bring the best and work together, and sometimes we disagree, but sometimes those disagreements and discussions make us stronger. And so hopefully, like, you know, you can find other like-minded people who are noticing the problems that are within your union and your education system, and start asking, well, what could we do differently, and who has different ideas? And maybe one day that will lead to something changing on a structural level. But also you might find that there's a way for you to accomplish some of the goals that you want, maybe on a smaller scale. And maybe that grows so much that it becomes popular and it's replicated in other places. Like the Black Panthers, their mutual aid program for free breakfast, right? They're like, lots of school children are hungry. They don't have food. It's hard to study and pay attention. And that program was so popular that it was basically adopted by the government, right? Eventually. But it's just a bunch of people who were like, let's just get together and feed kids, right? And I don't know if they ever thought like this will become co-opted by the government, but but at the end of the day, if the kids are fed, the kids are fed, right? So, okay. All right, there's something else in this room, so we're clearing off, but I'll be around if you want to hang out and talk. Thank you so much for coming.